welcome to Rauta's opinion video. This time I'm just more like a pondering with random thoughts rather than focused idea. Sounds familiar? Yes, because it's Rauta, goddammit. Anyway, this time the topic is, why is retro so hated word in metal? Or more like, what is this paradox? We can't really like the new styles of metal, namely metalcore, deathcore, who knows what kind of post-black we're talking about, but we still hate retro. Now that puts a lot of people into very much like between the rock and the hard place. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. Now there are lots of people who kind of say like, yeah, old school is the name of the game. I like music that was done in the 80s, early 90s. Especially this holds true when we're talking about black metal. Many people have almost like this nostalgic feeling or view, idea of what was going on in early Norway. That is second wave, the first waves of second wave. You know, the early 1990s. Bands like Immortal, Mayhem, Emperor, and you name it, were coming and doing their very first albums. Bands like Darkthrone, Satyricon, and etc. They were doing their music like in a storm, taking the whole scene suddenly, and it was like as if the 80s never happened. When we're talking about old school to these people, yeah, they're referring to 80s, dropping names like Venom, but not all people, because not all consider Venom to be black metal. But that's a different discussion. And then we have people mentioning Celtic Frost or Hellhammer. We have people mentioning Bathory, obviously, even Merciful Fate and other bands. Some drop names from Latin America. You know, the kind of names that had trasher parts put into black metalish ways, or at least spitting on the face of God or Jesus or whatever. You know, the kind of a black trash names, which then again were just called black metal. I mean, basically, if Bathory, you know, the early albums, 3 first ones, would come to today, people would most likely say, a lot of people I guess, would say it's black trash. It's not purely black metal, because it doesn't really sound what is often called the golden era of black metal. And now we're going back, once again, to the early 90s. Early or mid 90s, but not so much the late 90s. That's when the Matrix era, the kind of a ending of golden era started to happen. You know, people having suddenly all those Matrix outfits, and suddenly it was going all over the places instead of what was going on in the early 90s. But when you really think about it, you start noticing that there are lots of bands still doing black metal the very 1990s ways. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about 1991 or 1996. That kind of black metal is very much a dominating thing among the world of black metal. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about Finnish bands or Swedish bands, Icelandic bands. Well, they might be a little bit different with their more dissonant, kind of a more modern take of black metal. Or German bands who either, you know, emulate what is going on in Finland, or then again take a look at Sweden or Norway. Doesn't matter what country we are talking about, lots of bands are trying to do what happened in the 90s. And this is something that is kind of a peculiar. Now if you really think about it, in 2021, it's been like 30 years of having this second wave of black metal. And when you really think about it, the 80s, which is kind of a generally seen as the first wave. I mean, there wasn't too many bands, and it's not likely that people in 1986 decided to say, yeah, I think this is the start of second wave black metal. You know, it's not like people, well, I can't say for sure, but the majority of people, it's not like people figured out, like when Bloodfire Death by Bathory came out, okay, this is the end of era number 1. Now there's no turning back. It's all gonna be black trash from now on. So a lot of bands that started either, you know, in the early 90s or even late 80s, but didn't really have albums out by the 80s. Well, they were more or less pioneers or latecomers to the party in terms of second wave black metal. Now, going back to this day and what this has to do with the term retro. Now, when you really think about it, these bands nowadays doing the music that was done some 20 or 30 years ago are kind of a retro-ish. Yet there are a lot of people who kind of shun upon, you know, are like allergic to the word retro. Like, we are not a retro band. You know, get it. That's the first thing. I mean, I've had this conversation with many people over the years. People are almost like allergic to the word retro, as if it was suggesting something that you really shouldn't do, as it meant a kind of a rotten apple, a kind of a band that would copy the style that wasn't even good, even though it was. Now, the funny thing is, when we're talking about, for example, video games, where the retro is used in a very, very much more positive context. In ways like, yeah, hey, these guys are doing 1980s or 1990s kind of a video game, like old school graphics, pixels and, digital voices, which is very, very different from nowadays technique or technology. But when it comes to bands, even when they are really copying style from, some 25, 30 years ago, people like retro, don't do it, I'm allergic to that stuff, I don't want to go near the word retro. As it's like suddenly some worse version of, what is seen as vintage. Now, sometimes these two words kind of overlap. Like people are saying like vintage, yeah, that's battery, that's old school and stuff like that. That's really something to be, praised about. Like you really have to praise battery even if you don't really like it. Just because they're kind of like the forefathers, pioneers of the whole thing here. But really, when you're starting to copy that stuff, you kind of become a retro. But that's exactly what's once again happening. Now, not only this is part of the paradox here, but there are lots of people who are kind of like stuck in time. Like as if 1990s never went away. But here 30 years later, they are still, kind of different and older and all that stuff. And they see new waves of music suddenly like a bad thing. Now, this makes me think, like, did they feel, or do they feel, in fact, still, that this era when these guys were, teenagers, youngsters, like, this is the holy thing that cannot be touched, and it's not even retro to go back to your, teenager years, even if it makes reality. In reality, you being retro, you being kind of old-fashioned, and at the same time denying or, shaking fists at these youngsters who are doing something else. Maybe it's called third wave. I remember describing some of the reviewable albums as kind of a third wave black metal, especially with those bands who have this kind of a more modern dissonant sound. There are lots of bands from Iceland specifically, which are definitely something else than your typical 1990s retro-ish black metal bands. And also there are lots of what is usually known as post-black metal, kind of having black metal elements, especially the kind of a sound, the production, but also the kind of a vocals, even some of the images and the overall feeling might be very, very much a black metal, but there's something that separates them from what was going on in the 90s or in the early 2000s. Like, for example, some of the bands are more like flirting with generally known as post-metal, having more of these atmospheric parts, these kind of a building the climax or whatever you want to call it, and not exactly sounding like your typical black metal, but are not necessarily seen as like the new wave, the modern stuff. Now, I know that third wave black metal is not commonly used, but I like to use it as in order to separate the newer bands from the rest. And I've noticed that some people are like giving me these weird looks, like, hey, what are you talking about? Are you a crazy person? Like, what is the new deal here? And at the same time, you really can't compare these modern bands to a lot of these older names, because they are different. Now, obviously, sometimes genres and sub-genres got coined later on. I mean, like, back in the days, I remember reading this Storm G Warrior thing of Celtic Frost and Hellhammer, respectively, and saying something like, back in the 80s, all these different styles of extreme metal were called, death metal. So it didn't really matter whether you're a thrash metal band, whether you're a death metal band, black metal band, or some kind of a weird hybrid of these all. They were just kind of a death metal, kind of extreme form of music. I don't know when extreme metal was, introduced to people in general, but that is kind of a more like an umbrella term. Describing all these styles and more, even Funeral Doom and stuff like that, which is more extreme, namely and literally, rather than just being, the kind of a mainstream heavy metal or whatever, like even stoner rock or the kind of a classic doom metal, which is not in extreme, maybe except for slowness and sometimes dullness. But back in the days, things were different, and these coin terms started to take part of the discussion and the culture only a lot later on. And suddenly, obviously, by the 90s, black metal was a thing. You know, there were those spray paints, and there were zines doing articles and whatever, and even sometimes bands would like take a CD and just like say, okay, we are Norwegian black metal, to kind of emphasize we are black metal from Norway, not death metal from Finland. You know, the kind of idea. Like nowadays it feels kind of stupid. Like when you have to tell on the CD cover or LP cover that you are certain style from a certain country, it feels kind of like dumb. But then again, that was years and years before internet became a thing. And obviously things were different. And maybe these youngsters had so much passion that it needed to be emphasized. But anyway, that's a little bit different discussion. But I'm still kind of puzzled. How come people, when they become older, they kind of don't necessarily realize that they have become older. So instead, they have still this nostalgic feeling going back, and they are denying at the same time these newer bands. Yet they refuse to be called retro or whatever. So it's kind of a peculiar. Like, some people don't really move forward. They kind of become, like, set in stone, as if it was petrified in this form, like, I had the energy and now I don't. I became petrified in 1998. I'm not going to move from here. I'm not going to listen to anything nearer than that, and anything older than that I'm not going to even touch. I don't know. But anyway, what is your thought about this idea? Is retro a cool word, or is it a bad one? Is it kind of a next to cursing, or is it just a neutral way to describe something that sounds somewhat similar to what was happening in the past? What are your thoughts about modern music? Are you one of those petrified corpses, or do you have the passion for newer music, even though sometimes it really sucks? But then again, which era didn't have the bands that sucked? There is no era which didn't have bands that suck, music that sucks. Anyway, that's the topic. That's some food for your thought. And meanwhile you're watching this, I should be having fun at Steelhorde's 2021 festival, drinking beer maybe, and all that stuff. We will find later on how did that turn out and whether or not I have more interviews coming your way. Anyway, stay tuned for Rauta. See you with more interviews, reviews, and whatever. And before I forget to mention, Rauta is now on TikTok. Yes, future is very much here. I don't know what it would mean. Take care, bye bye, and stay metal.